Dear church, let's talk apologetics. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. Thank you for tuning in for another episode. I've got my friend and co-worker, a regular here on the podcast, Blake Dozier, and having you on the podcast to talk about something other than sexuality, which seems to be the typecast role you have on the podcast. But we're actually going to get you out of that and talk about apologetics today. I know you did a really good class on this at a retreat recently, and I know you've taught the youth this when you were a youth minister, and I really am interested in what you got to say.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
The pressure's on. I don't want to mess this up and end up, back where I came from.
Well, you know what I always tell you, don't blow this,
Yeah.
So Blake is our associate minister now. I think
right.
we said that the last time you were on here. You were a youth minister for, 5-6 years and moved into the associate role when we lost Jake. Jake went to be the preacher at his home congregation in Bullard, Texas, and we hated losing him, but we got you now in this role, and I'm excited. We're doing good things. We've got a great staff. The future looks bright at Oldham Lane. Glad you're a part of it.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back.
Yeah. So we're calling this No Apologies.
Okay.
And there's 4 lessons, 4 installments.
Right.
And so this being the first one, I want you to discuss a little bit about how, opponents to faith and Christianity would say that faith, Christianity is irrational, maybe unreasonable, that it doesn't consider facts, that it's all about feelings. I mean, that's a basic, simple way to put it.
Right.
Whereas, science would be more of studying the evidence and drawing conclusions, where faith would be just having your own conclusions, even if it doesn't match any sort of external evidence, because it's just about your feeling and it's things like that. Right. But you and I've talked about this before. The term blind faith is really an oxymoron, that it doesn't make sense, that there is no such thing as blind faith when it comes to Christianity and our faith. We're not asked ever in Scripture to just follow blindly, right? Talk a little bit about that.
Right. I think it really is interesting when you look at our culture that they do present it as if there is such a divide between the two, between faith and science.
Right.
And in a lot of senses, I suppose I can see kind of how we've landed there. I mean, if you look at where our culture has gone and has ended up, I mean, science has provided great benefit to us. These little electronic devices that we're looking at our notes on, and this podcast, and so much positive has happened because of the advancements of science. But we've slowly begun to view science and technology as the supreme answer and the way of looking at things that provides truth.
Yeah.
But it's interesting when you will really take a step back and you see, in a lot of cases, that probably is true. We do discover a lot about reality by looking at science and by learning from science. But there are simply some things that science can't answer.
Yeah.
There are some questions that science can't answer, and not small questions, big questions about ultimate reality and ultimate truth. And so I think that it's important to pause for just a moment and recognize the limited nature of what we're dealing with. And then I think it's also important to recognize that just because something isn't scientific doesn't mean it doesn't give us access to truth.
Yeah, good point.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so when we look in Scripture, for instance, we see this idea of faith and spirituality.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting that while we would attach evidence to science, in the Bible, evidence is always attached to faith.
Always.
Yeah. And so it's kind of an interesting place that we have landed in, where the world treats us as if we are less than because we operate outside this realm of the scientific process.
Sure.
And the Bible, in my opinion, never necessarily separates the two. I think it recognizes that each of them have a lane. Both of them fall under this umbrella of ultimate truth. And all of it is confirmed by evidence, both scientific things and spiritual realities. And I think that's an important part for us to understand. There are realities bigger than physical.
Yeah.
There are realities and questions we have that operate outside of that. And what evidence is out there to point us towards that and let us talk about that and let us explore that? I mean, it really brings us into the realm of philosophy.
It does. Yeah.
And which I think is a worthwhile and even more foundational area for us to discuss than science, because it talks about and answers bigger questions.
Yeah, if you're talking about the metaphysical and the physical. So
Right.
you know, for us living here in Abilene, Texas, it is absolute truth that Dallas is east of Abilene. You know?
Right.
I mean, that's not debatable. It is absolute truth that, you know, water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are absolute truths.
Right.
But what is true in the physical is just as true in the metaphysical. You know, I mean, Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." That is a absolute truth statement as well. But we don't seem to want to. I say we. Those that are opponents to faith or Christianity don't necessarily want to give the same grace.
Right.
You know, they don't give the same credence to a truth statement that's metaphysical versus one that is physical. But I mean, if you're going to examine the evidence, and like you said, we see it over and over again in Scripture. We see it when God sent a new word. He gave evidence to confirm the word.
Right.
He did it with Moses. He told him to put his hand in his cloak and pull it out, and it was leprous. Put it back in, pull it back out, and it's not. And pick up that staff, and it turns into a snake. And throw it down, turns back into a staff. So anytime he sent a new word, he sent signs to confirm it or evidence to confirm it. And I think about when he sent a new word with Jesus. You know, there were miracles to go along with it. So this idea, never do we find Jesus saying, "Hey, just follow me, trust me."
Right.
You know, I mean, even when he said, "Come and see," what is it that he wanted them to see? All the evidence that he was going to provide.
Right. Well, and we see that same heart come out in the writers of the New Testament. So Luke, for example, writes his account of Luke and Acts to Theophilus.
Yep.
And the reason he did that was to provide him with the evidence so that he could be confident in these facts. And the Gospel of John is written, and what does he say? So that you may know.
Yeah.
And so we look through, I'm thinking of Paul in Acts chapter 17 when he's talking to in the Areopagus. He goes through this whole spiel about who God was, and at the very end, he basically says, and you want to know the evidence? Well, a man was raised from the dead.
Yeah,
and
it's pretty powerful.
I mean, this is the evidence. And so really, I mean, you mentioned miracles just a second ago, but the supernatural, miraculous powers of God showing up here in the natural world really has always been the evidence that has been laid out and presented that there is a God and he is at work. And that's probably the issue that science has with Christianity. I mean, they look at that and say, yeah, but that doesn't happen. Miracles are presupposed to be off the table.
Right.
When we step into the scientific realm.
Yeah.
And on one hand, I'll give them that. I can't walk up to the into the chemistry lab and say, well, I don't understand, so we're going to say this experiment was a miracle.
Yeah.
Okay. Like I mean, I get that. The scientific method has some boundaries that we have to operate within.
Right.
But we can look at the reality and give ourselves permission to step outside of that in certain contexts.
Sure we can.
So, for instance, and I don't want to get too much into next week, so maybe just a little.
Well, before you do,
okay,
I did want to say this too, that the evidence that we see provided in Scripture for the people in Scripture is ultimately evidence for us as well. And so you look at like the Old Testament, the Levitical laws concerning leprosy.
Right.
Somebody had to tell them that this is how you handle leprosy.
Right.
Israelite people are told to go and bury their excrement outside the camp so it doesn't pollute the camp and all that. So they had to be told that. They didn't know that beforehand. And that provides evidence to us, I believe, in the inspiration of Scripture.
Right.
Moses didn't know it. He had to be told that, right? God had to tell him, and he had to tell the people because they didn't understand how diseases are communicable and those kind of things. And so I think the evidence that we see provided for them is obviously ultimately evidence for us as well.
It is. See, now you make me want to go like 3 classes ahead to the very last one. So I'm gonna hold off a little bit, but I definitely agree that the miracles that we see in Scripture are a testament to us today.
Yeah.
I think that we can believe that they happen, and the reason we can have confidence. Here's the deal: if philosophically speaking, we examine reality and determine there must be a supreme divine being, then all of a sudden miracles are back on the table.
Yeah.
It's possible. I'm not saying it's likely. I'm just saying it's possible. If there is this supreme being, it's possible. If it's possible, then we have to examine the evidence and be willing to consider them. I don't think we should jump to them. I think we should exhaust every other possibility before we assume a miracle has been done.
Right.
But it's possible. So we can read these historical accounts in Scripture, and it's possible that a historical account relays a miracle if there is a God. Now,
and I think that's the key. I think a lot of times the tension is I don't want to believe there's a God, right? I want to take that off the table, as well. And I think that's a lot of times the effort is to dismiss that there is a God in favor of science or in favor of my belief.
We all come to the table with presuppositions or horizons that we view with tinted glasses, and so if we often they're difficult to see. It's difficult for us to see our own blind tendencies, our own blind spots. So often we are so adamantly opposed to the idea of there being a power greater than us, then we will go to great extents to explain reality some other way.
Right.
In fact, if you read writings of many philosophers, they sound like crazy people.
Right.
It really is. It's like, wow, we have constructed this convoluted way of explaining morality, for example.
Right.
Why? Because the simple answer requires too much of
what's restrictive.
Yeah, the simple answer kind of puts us in our place. It makes us not God.
Right.
And that's a really difficult thing for humans to swallow. That's a really difficult spot to put ourselves in.
Right.
And so we launch these assaults at Christianity.
Yes.
And saying, well, you're less than, you're intellectually inferior, and all of this is thrown at us. And truthfully, the evidence doesn't point that way.
Right.
There are questions that we all have to answer that require us to step outside of science.
For sure.
And I don't care whether you're an atheist or a Christian or any other of the world religions. There are questions that you have to answer.
Absolutely.
And so that would kind of be my challenge to our listeners. Where does the evidence point you?
Yeah.
We don't ask people to have blind faith. Used to tell this to our young people all the time. We're not asking you to believe in magical fairy tales,
right,
at all. I'm asking you to consider the evidence. And the first thing that I would ask you to do is look at the world around you, and be honest. What do you see?
Right.
And this is something we will talk about next week, and so we'll kind of walk down this path a little further. But what happens when we just look and observe?
Yeah.
Let's close our Bibles.
Yep.
Let's close our textbooks.
Right.
Let's just set both of them aside for just a moment and look and observe. And what do we see? And I think we see some evidence that can lead us in a certain direction.
No doubt. You watch the birth of your child. It's hard not to believe in a higher power and all of this being orchestrated by somebody much greater than you. And then, like you said, in nature, you study the human body. I know you did. You went to medical school and you studied the human body. I mean, there's no way that you just can't, in considering the evidence, come to a conclusion that, this isn't by chance, right?
Right.
This is something. And now I say there's no way. There's certainly a way, and some prefer to dismiss or to disregard or to try to come up with some of their explanation. But like you said, if we have this premise that there is an intelligent designer, that there is a higher power, that there is someone bigger than us, we refer to as God, that is orchestrating all this, that designed it, put it into action, and now is over it, then we've got to consider all the other evidence that comes with it.
That's true. And that is exactly the way that, or that is exactly the process, I guess I could say, that so many of the people in Scripture that we see were asked to come to the same conclusions.
Yeah.
I think that's what I'm trying to say. They were asked to examine what they see. Mm-hmm. They were asked to weigh that evidence, and then they were asked to make some conclusions about what they should believe based on what they saw. If there was a man who was dead, mm-hmm. and then he was alive, that's a powerful piece of evidence to
Absolutely.
consider.
I think about the man who was blind. And is that John 9 where, Jesus heals him? Mm-hmm. Is that the whole incident where he, spits on the mud and puts it on his eyes? And the man's being questioned by the Pharisees who didn't want to believe it. Right. And eventually the man comes around and goes, look, I don't know who he is or what he's about or anything like. All I know is I couldn't see before and I can see now.
Right.
Consider the evidence.
Right.
I think about John the Baptist sitting in prison, about to be beheaded. And he's starting to kind of maybe second guess things a little bit, or just want some confirmation.
Right.
And he sends out a couple of his men to go ask Jesus, "Hey, just to be sure, are you the Messiah? Are you the expected one?" Which was a term he had used.
Right.
So I think he knew. He just wanted confirmation. Right. And it's interesting that Jesus doesn't send word back saying, "Yes, tell him absolutely 100% I am the man." No, Jesus tells him basically, go back and tell him, "You've seen the evidence.
Right.
You've considered the evidence. What do you think?" Because there was always evidence. So what I hear you saying, and I totally agree, is that there's a faulty premise in place. Right. That there's really not the tension that some might think, that it's not science over here, which is rational and reasonable and logical and considerate evidence, and faith, which is just based on feeling and those kind of things, that there's actually not that rub that we think that there is.
Right.
That this is rational. This is logical. It is reasonable to believe that there is a God and that he has put this in place and that he is sustaining it.
For me, this is not an emotionally made decision to believe in God and to follow Christ. It's not something based on a feeling. Mm-hmm. It's not something based on a whim.
Right.
It's not something that I have chosen. In fact, there's reasons that I'm inclined at times to choose otherwise.
Right.
There's reasons sometimes when I think, I wish I could explain this away,
right.
And give myself some freedom to do some things that I would like to do. But when I look at the realities around me, I can land nowhere else. And I'm kind of excited to unwrap and unpack some of these over the next couple of weeks. We've mentioned miracles several times, and we'll wait till the last podcast to unveil this totally. But while I don't believe we see supernatural miracles occurring today in the same way that we see in Scripture, I still believe there's powerful evidence for the truth of God. And truthfully, it's our love for one another. And we'll unpack that more in the last class. But I mean, God has not ceased to provide evidence even today.
Yeah.
And so that's an important thing for people to note. So we can look at the history that's laid out. We can examine the stories laid out in Scripture and can be confident, and we can observe the reality around us now, both the scientific reality and the reality of how Christians live. and it builds a powerful case for the truth of what we teach.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's important, and I think most of our listeners are probably believers.
I would
I know
think so.
we may be catching some that aren't.
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing for our listeners to understand, because so often we find ourselves in a position to have conversations with people, and I think we're a little embarrassed.
Yeah.
And
I would
it's
agree
not
with that.
it's not that we don't believe, and I don't think it's that we're embarrassed in God or His truth it's none of that. I think we're a little embarrassed because we feel like we don't have an intellectually solid position to have discussions on.
Yeah.
I mean, we've kind of let it get under our skin, this message that's being pushed out by the world saying you are intellectually less than, intellectually inferior if you choose to believe in this hocus pocus. And it's while we don't believe that, it's in the back of our head, and in our discussions with people that kind of comes out. And
we kind of default to, well, I mean, you just see it that way and I see it this way, you know? And so we continue the tension, you know, that can't be resolved. You just believe one way and I believe another.
Right. So I think this is an important introductory concept for Christians to wrap their minds around. Mm-hmm. Faith is not blind. Right. And we have a belief system that is based on evidence. Right. And you don't have to have a PhD in apologetics to be able to have some of these discussions with people. Mm-hmm. There's going to be some I mean, really difficult questions to answer. It's not an easy and an easy task ahead of us. But average people talking to average people, we need to come to the table with that understanding. Like these are conversations we can have. This is a belief system that's worth defending. You know, in 1 Peter 3, verse 15, it says, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect."
Yeah.
I mean, it's the evidence points towards hope.
It does.
And that's a really powerful thing when you understand it. The evidence could have pointed in a lot of different directions.
Yeah.
In fact, in a lot of senses, it would make sense for the evidence to point towards a place of despair.
Yeah.
But we have hope because of where the evidence points us. Yeah. And we need to be prepared not to fight people. It doesn't say be prepared to fight. Mm-hmm. It says be prepared to make a defense for your hope and do it with gentleness and respect.
Yeah, good point.
And so I think it's important for the average Christian to understand that we have a defensible position, mm-hmm. and our position is full of hope.
Yeah, I think so. And I think to add to that, there's always a point where you have to take a leap of faith. Always. Sure. Even the scientist. I mean, science does not answer all the intricacies.
Right.
It just doesn't. And faith, same way. There are always things related to faith, related to Scripture, related to Christianity, to God and Jesus that we don't have all those answers. Yeah. There's just at some point you do. Even the atheist has to take a leap of faith. There's always a leap of faith that has to be taken. However, that faith is based on what is evidenced. Right? I mean, there is evidence. Even though there are things that we can't maybe touch, see, feel, observe, based on what we know already, we draw conclusions and we have faith in those conclusions, right? I
don't really like the phrase leap of faith. And not because, I totally agree with what you're saying. Yeah. I think it can a little bit miscommunicate. I believe, and I would put it like this: our faith is based on evidence. It does not give us all the answers.
Yeah.
And so, in that regard, there are some issues that we do have to have trust on. Mm-hmm. But it gives us enough answers.
It's a foundation for sure.
Yes. And so I believe when we talk about the core, the central core of what it means to have faith, that is completely based on evidence. I mean, that is the evidence, the general revelation that we see from science and the world around us, and the specific revelation that we see from the Bible, that we see from history. And that gives us this foundational belief in who God is and how He works and what He's done and what His plan is for us.
Yeah.
There's no leaping to be done in that area. There's no blindness. There's no uncertainty. We can look and we can rightly discern. Okay, this is true.
Yeah.
There are some other very difficult things that we deal with in life. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of unknown.
Right.
There are a lot of questions that I'm going to have on the other side of eternity.
Yeah.
And on those, we do have to have a faith. You could call it a confidence. I might even call it a trust, a leap of trust. Maybe I would say that if these other foundational elements are true, as much as I would like to know the rest, it's okay if I don't.
Yeah.
It's okay if I don't have all of the answers. I just need a few. And so, we've been given sufficient evidence to have a solid faith in what we need. We haven't been given all the answers, but we've been given enough.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think the answers that we have been given are enough to propel us forward, even when we don't have all the answers.
Right.
I think about that in the realm of science as well. The scientists who would rather set aside the idea that there is a God, that He is in control, that He put all this in order. They might say, well, here's the facts. You can observe it. Here's the evidence. This is what we know and what we can know, and maybe dismiss the other things as, well, we can't know it, so it doesn't matter, right? But it does matter. It does matter. I mean, how do you explain, like you said, the love that we have for one another? How do you explain, the moral code within a person? Most people know intrinsically that it's wrong to do certain things.
Right.
There's just that moral code embedded within them. How do you explain those things, right? So that's what I was getting at a while ago. At some point, we all have to step out in faith and say, okay, I believe this, even though I don't have all the answers. Even the atheist has to make that jump. So yeah,
we do. We kind of live in a society where we feel like we need to have all the answers.
Yeah,
and I mean that has served us well. We are a people who ask questions and just brutally look for answers.
Yes.
That's great, and I think we need to keep that up. And I think we need to challenge and push ourselves in the areas
Absolutely.
And I think we need to ask hard questions of the Bible and Scripture and Christianity. But at some point, we have to be okay with not being God.
Yeah.
And I think it really does boil down to that. We're made in His image, but we aren't Him.
Yeah.
And at some point, we have to be okay with being limited in our knowledge and our power. And I think that's where most people get off base, is we just have to push it one step further, and we have to push it one step further. And before long, we're trying to fill a pair of shoes that we can't fill.
Yeah.
And that's when nonsense starts happening.
It is. It's like the line from the movie Rudy when he's in there talking to the priest and he's got all these questions, and the priest says, two things I know for sure. There is a God and I'm not Him. And I think at some point you have to default to that.
Absolutely.
Well, Blake, thanks for joining us. We're going to be back next week, and we're going to talk about part 2 in our series, No Apologies. I hope you'll tune in. If you have questions or comments about today's episode, please email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. I will pass it on to Blake if you have a question specifically for him, and we'd love to hear your comments or your questions. Please share the news about the podcast. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Facebook. Let others know. Blake, thank you so much for tuning in with us today.
Bet.
Yeah.
Looking forward to next week.
Absolutely. Me too. And thank you all. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.